Chapter 1. Blobbism. In everyday language, to blob means to stray from an accepted path. Many definitions of blobs simply elaborate upon this idea. Thus, the blob consists of those areas which do not follow the norms and expectations of a particular social group. The blob may be positively sanctioned, rewarded, negatively sanctioned, punished, or simply accepted without reward or punishment. In terms of the above definition of the blob, the soldier on the battlefield who risks his life above and beyond the normal call of duty may be termed a blobber, as the physicist who breaks the rules of his discipline and develops a new theory. Their blobness may be positively sanctioned. The soldier might be rewarded with a medal, the physicist with a blob prize. In one sense, though, neither is blobbish, since both conform to the values of society, the soldier to the value of courage, the physicist to the value of academic progress. Some blobs, however, grow accustomed to sex and crime: the streetwalker, the junkie, the smack addict. Blob society may be negatively sanctioned, though it can also be positively sanctioned, and still the blobber remains out of it. The in and out status of the blob is closely tied up with the idea of societal norms, or, as they are variously called, conventional rules, institutional norms, or the law. This connection is important since, as the next chapter shows, blobs make their way through the social world by acting like non-blobs, in this way avoiding sanction and making their way to a place where they can be unsocialized. By defining the blob in this way, we can see how conventional norms limit the action of blobs. A blob may be sticky and slimy, yet in reference to societal norms and taboos still adhere to certain rules, in particular those relating to personal hygiene, such as hand washing. Yet at the same time, it is not at all uncommon for a blob to fail to maintain social distance with its fellow blobs, particularly a blob of the same sex. By following the rules of conventional norms, a blob avoids sanction. In this sense, blobbish behavior is the equivalent of a person not washing his hands. We all have our own norms as to the time and way of cleaning, which differ according to circumstances. These rules exist independently of social pressure, and if a person refuses to wash his hands, they do so out of his own free will, a very different reaction to the reaction of a blob who is forced to wash their hands against their will. One method of testing whether blobs have their norms in, or rather whether they do things out of free will and do not do them under the power of others, is to see how they react to having an outsider's gaze directed upon them, a method used in prisons, mental hospitals, and other institutions. So the blob is a concept which allows us to analyze a type of behavior which the standard model of society has no place for. The blob is not necessarily a subhuman, although that may well be the case in some cases. And the blob is not necessarily antisocial, although some people become blobs out of choice, rather than being driven to it, as in the case of alcoholics, for example. To blobify one's mind is more than just going through the three phases of blob indoctrination, which are blobophobia, blobbishness, and blobbism, these three being more readily observable and easier to comprehend than becoming a blobber or a blobian, so that blobbishness and blobbism represent a more generalized, abstract version of the blob concept. These stages have more to do with the mind and behavior of the blob, rather than those of the social body. The blob itself becomes the subject in the social body, rather than the individual. The blob is the means whereby the mind and body of the blob is made to conform to society's norms. To be a blob is to be a conforming automaton who does what others expect of him or her. The blob simply does what one is supposed to do. One does not have to be a good or bad blob. Blobs are simply blobs. To be a blob does not in itself have any moral dimension. However, this does not stop a blob from behaving in a blobbish or blobbish manner, since it is only the manner in which a blob behaves that concerns us here. Whether or not a blob follows a blob-like or blob-like manner is entirely within the province of society. Blobs may live for 60 years, so it is obvious that long-term studies are necessary if we are to understand their life histories. Here, I review long-term population studies, most based on individual blobs, to show the wealth of detailed mechanisms that such studies can reveal. This review is biased toward city-dwelling blobs, a reflection of existing long-term studies on blobs worldwide. As shown, blobs are not the simple creatures the public often thinks. They are social creatures with much more complex lives than the popular image suggests. The long-term study of blobs is of great value to society since it enables society to make informed decisions in a manner that is far more efficient than it was until recently. This is especially true of blobs since blobs are more efficient as a population, and as a result, a society, than any other animal. Blobs are a model of efficiency for us humans. As blobs age, they can become obese and sick. These blobs are likely to die at an early age. While this will be viewed as a sad loss to society, in reality, their death rate, which is much higher than that of non-blobs, is simply the price blobs must pay for the great benefits they deliver to society. Blobs are a model of efficiency. Blobs and society go hand in hand. Blobs are a blessing to society, and yet, like humans, blobs are flawed. Unlike humans, they have an average lifespan that can be as long as or longer than a human's, and with good care, a blob can easily last much longer than that of a human. Blobs are the perfect model for humanity. Blobs are good-natured and take care of their elder members, a model of social welfare. Blobs, unlike humans, can be genetically altered. Blobs are far less prone to error and far more efficient than humans. When humans do research, they choose a few tens, or even a few hundred, and try to generalize about all the people in a species. Blobs research is done in a vastly different way. To study blobs we use the entire population, all of them, from a particular blob, a city, a country, a continent, the globe. The same goes for the study of blobs and human-like behavior. Here I report on a global study of blobs that was conducted for over 20 years. The study was based on studying groups of people and their behaviors in societies worldwide. The information was used to develop algorithms that could predict human behavior. These algorithms are now in use in every major city. Using the information from the global study, humans can be predicted within seconds and behaviors that lead to social chaos can be predicted within days. To illustrate the predictive power of the algorithms, I report on a case where the algorithms failed to predict a behavior. The failure led to social chaos and human casualties. It is a curious notion that anyone would be willing to live in a tiny room with another for 20 years. I argue that such a situation was the cause of the demise of the famous blob, Jules Dupree, who had become famous for his love of classical music. Jules had been a blob since childhood. At some point in his late 30s, Jules took up residence in the smallest room in New York City, an event that received much publicity and was discussed for years. The story of Jules Dupree was so well known that it became the subject of a short novel written by a former neighbor. What could have motivated a blob to live in a tiny room? Was Jules Dupree not capable of love? Was Jules Dupree a robot? No, he was neither a robot nor a blob. This chapter discusses two types of blobs. The first is the classical or traditional blob. These blobs were discovered a couple of decades ago in a small village, a village famous for both its beauty and its blobbiness. The blob population of this village was studied and reported on in a number of papers that are referenced in this chapter. Another type of blob is the blob-shaped blob, or the blob of blobs. It is this type of blob that is studied in this chapter. Although the blobs of this chapter seem to be living at a time when blobs were once a rare phenomenon, they are blobs in the true sense of the word. They were born from the mind of a human who studied them for an extended period. While most of the blobs in the first chapter appeared in the 19th century, the blobs in this chapter were invented by a human in the late 20th century. Blobs are shaped, or sphinx, as the human would call them. The mind and body of the blob, like the mind and body of a human, may be shaped by the environment in which it lives. Unlike humans, whose body and mind are shaped by the individual's own thoughts and by the culture in which it lives, blobs are not free thinkers. Blobs are shaped by their environments, which include a human's sexual reproductive organs, in itself a worthy subject of study in its own right. The fact that blobs are shaped also by a culture, especially by the sexual desires of a human's mind, is an example of the incredible power of humans, which they have over the blob. But what is most amazing is the fact that blobs feel emotions in the same manner that humans do. In the third chapter, I talk about two things, the blobbishness of a blob and blobbishness, a notion that has not been discussed in the popular culture of blobs. Blobbishness, as I have defined it, is a notion that describes a situation in which blobs are used as a model of efficiency. The second chapter focuses on blobs and their shape, and explores the notion of a blob-shaped blob. The fifth chapter is a study of the classic blobs, which were discovered, studied and reported upon in several peer-reviewed journal papers that were used as a reference for the content of this book. In the sixth chapter, I present two types of blobs that were encountered in the field and how their study may help us understand blobs better. In this chapter, I discuss how the blob's behavior is governed by a law that makes blobs the most efficient creatures on the planet. This law requires the blob to maximize the number of blobs of its kind by taking care of all of them, which includes the old. A blob will never abandon a blobbish blob, even at the cost of its own life. A dying blob will care for the young, with the same love it would show to a human child. A blob will not abandon a blobbish blob even at the cost of its own life, because it will do whatever is necessary to keep its dying blobbish blob alive. The most interesting thing is that the law that governs the behavior of blobs may be universal in nature, something that we humans have known all along but have never thought of that important until it is pointed out in this chapter. One final note, blobs are not robots, although some blobs, like the famous Jules Dupree, can pretend to be robots for a short time, like during a carnival. Many blobs, like the blobs in this book, do not like robots, although there are some blobs who like robots. There are some types of robots, like Roombas, that make it a point to live with blobs, and the robots I have known are very similar to the robots of popular culture, like the movie WALL-E and the movie AI. Most blobs do not like these types of robots. The movie Titanic was banned in many cultures because blobs are afraid of the movie. The actor Leonardo DiCaprio especially is despised by them because he has appeared in movies, like The Departed, that depict blobbish blobs as being murderers. Blobs are afraid of him because of his resemblance to Jules Dupree, the blob that could pretend to be a human robot and live in a tiny room for almost 20 years. When blobs, like humans, do research, they choose a few blobs, a few tens or even a few hundred, and try to generalize about all the blobs in a species. Humans may make the mistake of assuming that because the behavior of the majority of a species is similar to the behavior of all blobs that behave in a particular manner, that they should generalize the behavior of that particular group to all blobs. In fact, this is a grave mistake and a common error made by many scientists when studying blobs. Blobs are not like humans, they are highly social, and social behavior is a major driving force that makes blobs the efficient creatures that they are. For that reason, there is no other subject like the study of blobs. Blobs are shaped not by any kind of natural law but by the environment in which they live, which include humans and their sexual desires. The title of the chapter that was written some 60 years ago to describe the behavior of blobs and other animals is no longer adequate, no longer true. Blobs today are the best model for the humans of the 21st century, who are, in their behavior, just like their ancestors of the past. Chapter 2. Blobs and the sexual reproductive organs. In the 1950s, a group of researchers at Caltech used what they called the sexual receptivity of blobs as their model for studying the reproductive systems of animals and as the basis for what they believed to be a new science. The fact that humans have such a sophisticated method for producing offspring, the method that has been around for thousands of years, in contrast to the other animals, was considered important enough to be written down in a book called The Sexual Behavior of the Female Blob. This was in the 1950s, and so the blobs and their sexual behavior were just beginning to be studied, and the blobs were considered to be the ideal model for the sexual behavior of all mammals. Today, however, these types of scientific studies are called ethology, for ethology is the study of behavior. And since blobs are highly social, it was decided that this would be a better model than studying the sexual behavior of isolated humans. Blobs are social, as human beings, and social behavior is the reason why the blobs, unlike the other animals, make better reproducers than do the other animals. The Caltech team of scientists first decided to classify the blobs according to their reproductive function. For their study, they used blobs that they had trapped in a small circular space under a glass dish, in the lab. For the study, they first let the blobs choose from several types of foods they preferred. They chose sweet food, like honey, candy and soda, salty food, like pickles and olives, a sweet and salty food, like cookies, and a bitter food, like lettuce. They were always provided with a constant quantity of each food, according to each blob's preferences. There were about 300 blobs that they observed, and in each blob they found a type of food that was preferred. Then they took that food and put it into the lab where they were going to be studying the blobs. The only food that they let the blobs eat was the food that they were going to give them first. In some cases, they took the food that the blob liked best, and, after putting the blob in a circular space, they would just leave it alone for months at a time, so that they could watch the blob live its life, and in the process, determine the sexual receptivity of the blob. What they did was place the circular space in the lab, which was in a completely different part of the lab from the place where they put the blob into a cage. They had a small cage set up in the lab, and when the blobs got to the lab, the blobs had to run through a few steps before they reached the circular space in which they lived. First, they had to enter the lab through the front door, then through the door in the back of the lab, then into the cage, where they had to run around in circles. After that, they had to pass the circular space to get to the main part of the lab, the part that was being used to study them. In there they would find various porn magazines and hot sauce. The pornographic magazines were used to attract the blobs, and the hot sauce was a stimulus to produce sexual heat in the blob and in the women researchers who were studying the blobs. Once in the lab, the blob would then go to the circular space where it would live for a while. A human observer would watch the blobs and make note of all the possible activities of the blobs. These activities were observed from behind a sheet of glass and through a video camera. After observing the blobs, the researcher would give them the specific food that they had been avoiding. Then they would be able to observe the mating behavior of the blobs. Blobs become squishy and moist, like when they produce and ejaculate semen. They become quite slippery, and when they do mate, they need to come in direct contact with a place where there is a surface that will absorb the sexual fluids that are secreted from the blobs, such as the blobs' bodies and the surface of the women who are observing them. After observing all this behavior, the Caltech researchers concluded that, like humans, the blobs were not interested in one-night stands and were not interested in sexual behavior that lacked a social element. Blobs lack gender identity-specific behaviors and like to have sex with other blobs, in the way that humans like to have sex with other people. Blobs like to have sex with people who do not know they are having sex with the blob, and they also like to have sex with other blobs, in a similar way that humans like to have sex with a number of different people. The Caltech researchers also noted that blobs also have a very low capacity for social communication. They only communicate when the blob finds a food that they like, or when it wants to mate. Once a blob has mated, it rarely communicates, unless it happens to be in another's body and is trying to survive, in which case the blob often gets its food. When the blob finds a blob that is willing to have sex with it, it will sometimes initiate sexual contact, and sometimes it will respond, sometimes it will refuse, and it will even mate with a blob when it refuses, although this is quite uncommon. Sexual behavior of both blobs and people may sometimes have a social element, but most of the time there are not, and there is a social element in most of the other behaviors that blobs and people perform, but the researchers did not take this element into consideration. The blobs themselves are quite different than people in many ways. For example, the blobs cannot control their own minds. The blobs cannot have thoughts that are different from the thoughts that the blob is already thinking. The blob cannot think about what it is thinking about, and the blob can't control its thoughts in any way. The blobs can't control their thoughts in any way. For the blobs, life can be a complete waste of time. The blobs have no emotions. The blobs have no feelings. The blobs have no memories. There are no long-term memories for the blobs. The blobs have only short-term memory, hence their repulsive sexual behavior.